Marcus Rath, welcome into the weeds, mate. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Mate, no one in New South Wales and probably Australia knows as much about conservative politics, the history of it, how we got to where we are with conservative politics and where it's going, as much as you. How like you are the sort of keeper of the sacred knowledge. How did a kid from Wollongong, a pretty working class area, end up you're not from a privileged background, don't have a sort of storied family behind you. How did you end up being an arch conservative, mate, and joining the young Liberals and the Sydney Conservative Club as a young man? How did a young man from Wollongong find himself in that predicament?
Good question. You're right. I didn't come from the sort of big end of town. If you had asked me about how my parents voted when I was growing up, I probably would have said Labor, or they probably became Liberal voters later in life. I think for me, when I first joined the Young Liberals, I was 16. In my school uniform, it was a bit cringe. I think this sounds very, very cringe, but I really loved John Howard and Peter Costello.
Well, I'm glad I've got the John Howard meme cup DJing there.
That's great. And I think that for me, I thought they were doing an excellent job. I was very interested in economics more so than politics, if you go back to high school. And I thought that they were doing a good job. I agreed largely with their approach of, smaller government, less tax, less regulation, privatization, things like that.
Classical Liberal.
I wouldn't say I'm an arch conservative, to your word before. I'd say I'm a classical Liberal. And I did hear the John Ruddick podcast. You had him on a few weeks ago. And it reminded me of why I'm not a libertarian or an anarcho-capitalist. I'm definitely a classical Liberal in the Howard, Costello, Reagan, Thatcher sort of school of thought. And I think I just started to get more interested and involved in politics. And probably my love of economic policy or economics was overtaken at some point by my love of politics, probably first or second year uni. And I thought, this is what I want to do, because you can have a huge impact over the lives of people in politics and in government, more so than probably any other profession.
And you set out on that course at a very young age. You decided politics, this conversation about economic policy, policy generally, and politics was for you. The flame was lit, and that you set out from. A lot of people stumble into it, come along opportunistically, but you set a course, and you set about involving yourself in a very, very serious and concerted way.
That's right. I think that at some point, maybe I was 19 or 20 or 21 or something, I thought, I want to be a member of parliament. And you look at all these great economists and academics, and largely their work sort of just sits there collecting dust on a library shelf or in a bottom drawer, and they never get to implement some of their great ideas. But we do. Us politicians, we have to vote on things all the time when parliament sits. And I thought, it's not good enough just to have great ideas. You want to see them implemented. And I thought that you could enact that change by being a member of parliament. Joined the Young Liberals at a young age, got involved.
Yeah, and that didn't scare you off, because it's robust. And certainly back then, what are we talking about? We're talking about the noughties.
I joined in 2006 at high school. First year uni was 2008. So it was just after we lost federal government, and we were down in the dumps everywhere. We're out of government, I think, at every level across Australia. But within a few years, we started winning stuff again. There was a lot of factional infighting, and I liked the game. It wasn't just that I liked the ideas of classical liberalism, less tax, less regulation, that type of stuff. But I also liked the game, the fight against Labor, but also the internal machinations in the Liberal Party interested me. And sometimes people join and they think it's not for them because it can be a pretty rough game. But yeah, I actually really enjoyed it.
Because if you don't have power in your organisation, you can't implement the policies. And back then, there was some pretty contentious issues that the coalitions had to deal with.
Yeah.
I think you're one of the first openly gay members of the coalition in New South Wales. But we had marriage equality, climate change. Some of these issues have, the coalition was really on a rack over them for a long time, weren't they?
Yeah, they were, and I think that those two issues in particular, I think, divided the Liberal Party in my early days in the party. Climate and marriage equality really divided the party. I think now on marriage equality, everyone thinks, well, I'm glad we just got it done. No one's calling for it to be reversed. And I think because it had overwhelming support from the Australian people, is that no one's calling for that. Maybe like in other jurisdictions around the world where it was done in a more undemocratic way from the judiciary or something like that. And on climate, I mean, the party's probably not, completely united. There are diverse opinions within the Liberal Party, but I think the position we're in now is far better than where we would have been 10 years ago.
Were you always a moderate because you're a key player in the moderate faction, or have you been on?
I was in the right. So I joined in Wollongong. All the branches at the time when I joined were from the right side of the Liberal Party. So I joined the right, and then later on I realised it wasn't for me. Very socially conservative. Some of them quite big government as well in terms of the way that they think that they can impose morality or use the power of the state to implement their agenda, and sort of less interested in free markets. So join the moderates later in life. We all make mistakes. You made a mistake, Jeremy, joining the Greens. So we all make mistakes, but we can correct it later.
We're all on a journey. We all mature.
That's right.
And you've been a fierce defender of the word liberal in itself, because we look at places like the United States where if you're a liberal, you're a Democrat. You're centre left or even hard left.
Yeah.
But you've been a fierce defender that in the sort of the British tradition, the Australian tradition, the liberal was the sort of that classical liberal.
Yeah, I don't know how academic you want me to get, but I think
Go for it, mate.
I think that if you go back to the Enlightenment, the sort of liberalism was born out of the Scottish Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment. The Scottish Enlightenment and some of those great thinkers from the Anglosphere like Locke and Mill and others,
Smith
were very much skeptical. The skeptical Enlightenment, smaller government, more power to the people in terms of democratic institutions and constitutions and the rule of law. And the Enlightenment that came from the continent, in particular from France, was the radical Enlightenment, Rousseau and people like that. It was very anti-aristocracy, very, very anti-monarchy, anti-church, whereas the British Enlightenment was a lot more based on in an evolutionary change rather than revolutionary. And liberalism grew out of that. So in Australia and in the UK, when we use the word liberal, it's often used in the sense of classical liberalism. In the US, at some point, I don't know at what point, they determined that the word liberal meant left. It meant the radical Enlightenment, progressive. But that's not the case in Australia. And I'm very glad that Robert Menzies all those years ago determined that we should be the Liberal Party, not the Conservative Party, and that, primarily I would call myself a liberal first and foremost. If you have to clarify, I would say a classical liberal. And they're the terms that I identify with more so than any other.
And what are those institutions that a classical liberal needs to defend? Democracy? Is it the monarchy? Are you a monarchist?
Yeah,
let's talk about democracy first.
Yeah, I think, democracy, I think that we've got one of the best systems in the world, Westminster parliamentary democracy, bicameralism with great legislative chambers like where we sit, separation of powers, federalism, the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of worship. these types of institutions and values. And the thing is that they are inherently classically liberal, but conservatives also want to conserve them. So in many ways in the Anglosphere, classical liberalism and conservatism are two sides of the same coin. Conservatives want to conserve them, but they're classically liberal in nature. So that's why I think that if the Liberal Party was in continental Europe, it would probably be 4 or 5 different parties. It would probably be a libertarian type party. There would probably be a populist party, anti-immigration, a Christian, party, a centrist, moderate type party. Whereas in the Liberal Party in Australia, all those different groups coexist in one. And it comes back to this conservatism and classical liberalism both having a home in the Liberal Party. I mean, talking about another figure, Edmund Burke, he was a conservative, probably the father of modern conservatism, but he was also a classical liberal, a student of Adam Smith. He believed in free trade. He believed in democratic liberal institutions. So I think that they do happily coexist, not always happily. Marriage equality probably was one where the conservative approach and the classically liberal approach differed, but most of the times they do go hand in hand quite well.
And hence, the Liberal Party's been an incredibly successful political project, blending those two elements.
Yeah.
And it's for a long time, what hasn't had a major threat on the right, I suppose, apart from One Nation.
Yeah.
But they just seem ideologically not to have a deep base, and the Libertarians. So they're all sort of fringe micro parties out there on the right that haven't really challenged the Liberals and the coalition for primacy, have they?
No, that's right. And I think One Nation is, it's essentially developed as an anti-immigration party, or at least that was its origin. And the Libertarian Party, again, I mean, what's the difference between a libertarian and a classical liberal? Well, a libertarian is more utopian, more ideological, more extreme. And there are things that...
And an anti-institution. There's things that it wants to pull apart.
Yeah, I think that a classical liberal supports limited government. A libertarian often supports no government or almost no government. There is a difference. The thing is, I suppose, is that there's not a huge amount of votes, in my opinion, by being an arch libertarian. In that a lot of people do care about freedom, but they also care about fairness and equality of opportunity. They do care about institutions and values. They don't just vote on freedom. If they did, the Libertarian Party would be getting 55% of the vote every election, even in the US, which has far stronger they value the sense of freedom more than even we do, and certainly more than Europe. The Libertarian Party can't get more than a few percent of the vote. So the Liberal Party is a catch-all party on the right and even in the centre tending towards the right, which has made it incredibly successful. I think since World War II, the Liberal Party's been in power something like 2/3 of the time. So we have done
at a federal level.
Well, at a federal level.
Yep.
So we have done incredibly well, but there is an innate pragmatism to the Liberal Party that has meant that it's been able to govern for a huge proportion of the time. If we were radical, if we were overly ideological, we probably wouldn't be in government as often as we are.
And in that project, you had some key mentors. Don Harwin, the former Minister of State, minister in previous coalition government at the state level, and President of the Legislative Council. Parallels in your lives, like a lot. And he's been a key mentor of yours, and I suppose helped you move across to the moderates.
Yeah, he did, and it was very helpful in those early days, moving across to the moderates. And Don was very generous in his time and in his mentoring. And I think it helps. I think you need those people to learn from people that have been there before you. I think I'd always probably wanted to be in the upper house, not the lower house. I think you can have those policy debates and really take more of an interest in the committee work and legislation, and not have to deal with getting elected every 4 years. Constituents, yes, yes. I'm very, very grateful I don't have an electorate or constituents. And Don, because he had been there for so long, as a whip, as a president of the upper house, as a leader of the government in the upper house, I learned a lot from him, and similar interests in our policy areas and similar sort of backgrounds as well.
And you came in. What year were you elected?
So I came in March 22 when Don retired. So
That's
basically
right.
1 year out from the last election.
So you came in at the end of basically the Liberal Party in New South Wales's tenure that had which was unfortunate for you that you didn't get a chance to be. Did you end up being a parley sec?
No, I was the chair of the Law and Justice Committee for 1 year.
Okay.
And then we'll boot it out.
Looking back, what are the achievements? What are the highs and lows of a decade or more than a decade of coalition rule in New South Wales? What do you think was the hits and misses?
Yeah, and even though I only had 1 year in the Parliament with the Liberal Party,
you were working with them.
Yeah, I was the vice president of the Liberal Party. I was a staffer before that, so very, very much involved. I think that if you look at Sydney and look at New South Wales today, the former government, the 12 years were in power, completely transformed the city and the state. From the metro that we now use to West Connects to North Connects, things like the ICC at Darling Harbour or Sydney Modern, Art Gallery, so many things we build. I remember when we came into power in 2011, there was a real sense that we hadn't built any infrastructure for a decade, that nothing was getting built. I think they changed all that.
Like Labor had built the M7 and it took them forever to build a couple of freeways.
Yeah.
There was a real sense of inertia.
Yeah.
The government came in with an agenda for asset recycling, selling off some poles and wires, selling off the power stations.
Yeah, and look, I think that it wasn't popular. The two unpopular decisions that allowed us to build so much of this infrastructure was essentially the 49% lease of the poles and wires, which unlocked $23 billion of capital that built the metro, the West Connects, the North Connects, those cultural institutions, the hospitals, the schools, etc., and then keeping our expenses under control. And 45% of the state government's budget is public sector wages, and we kept public sector wages from growing radically out of control. They were not popular decisions. They weren't, but they allowed us to build so much of what we now love about Sydney. You would not have the metro today if it weren't for those two policies.
I don't see anyone out in Newtown campaigning to repeal West Connects. Just stop West Connects. It was a big campaign.
Yeah, Jenny Leong, she didn't stop West Connects.
Didn't stop it. And I don't see anyone out there campaigning to repeal it. It's pretty handy, the old West Connects.
Yes.
When you just go in anywhere and come out wherever you want.
Yeah.
But so public sector wage cap, that was a big thing, capping at 2%.
Yeah.
And there was a fair bit of industrial relations action in that decade. But what I think's funny is that since Labor's come to power, I think we might have seen more.
Yeah.
Like there's been now that the Labor Party is in power, we've seen just as much industrial relations turmoil. With unions now asking for significant wage rises. You've been pretty, previously and in your iteration now as an MP, you've been very critical of the trade unions and the link between the trade unions and Labor.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think that just on the point before on the wages cap, I think that it was an unpopular decision, but it was fair in that whether you're a nurse or a doctor, a train driver, a teacher, you're essentially getting the 2.5%. And then I think we increased it later on to 3 or 3.5. Whereas why there are so many strikes now is because each individual union now needs to negotiate with the government one by one on their pay deals. So they are all expecting a better deal than whatever the minimum sort of wages cap is. So I think that it has created this industrial anarchy over the last 2 years since Min's coming to power, which we've seen very clearly on the public transport system, on the train system in particular. So I don't think that has been a good thing. I think in terms of my opposition to the unions is that I believe in the individual. I'm not a collectivist. That's the first thing that I would say, and that unions are inherently collectivist in nature. I also think that we're in this absurd position where only 7% of the private sector workforce are members of a trade union, but in the chamber that we sit in and in the lower house, 100% of the Labor Party MPs are members of a trade union. They have 50% of conference floor, 50% of their admin committee. The unions give hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars when you add it all up to the Labor Party. So in many ways, the Labor Party is just the political arm, or political wing of the union movement. The union movement was there first, and it created the Labor Party, not the other way around. And I think that it's inherently unfair to Australians that we have what is a very small proportion of Australia being able to run one of our two major parties, a party of government. If it was a minor party, for instance, that got 7% of the vote, you would understand it. But it tries to be a party of government, despite representing a very small part of Australia.
What about the criticism that the coalition is the political wing of big business?
Well, it's just not true. I think there was...
But there's some very strong links there between, you see, chamber, the chambers of commerce, you see some of the big industry groups. What's your response to that criticism?
I think that increasingly there's I worked in insurance for 7 years, and where I worked, we gave 50-50 between the coalition and the Labor Party. Most corporates today, if you look at the ASX 200, most would give 50-50 between the two major parties.
In terms of political donations?
In terms of political donations, or increasingly nothing at all. They view it as a risk of being involved in political donations. Then at the other end, at the high net worth individual end, increasingly they're giving money to the Teals.
But you'd take the money if you could get it, wouldn't you?
Well, I'm sure Labor would take it too.
I know.
You might even take it too, Jeremy, if there were any high net worth individuals giving you some money.
Maybe I am. But that's not a no. You're just like there's someone else in there who's probably got a position more palatable to those billionaires on climate change.
Oh, but look, potentially. And I think that in New South Wales we're very lucky in that we have donation caps of about $7,000 and expenditure caps of around, I think, $150,000 or whatever per electorate. That is good. The federal system is absurd, where up until recently, and I know they're bringing in some reforms, but you could give an unlimited amount of money. I think anything below 10,000 you didn't even need to disclose, and you could spend an unlimited amount of money per electorate. So I think we need, I would say at a state level, more reform, not less. I'm not one that believes that big money should buy elections. And you look what's happening in the United States, I think it's an absurdity. You should be elected by the strength of your argument and your ideas, not by how much money you have. And I think that a lot of Liberals are increasingly thinking that. And yes, it's brought about because of realpolitik, which is the rise of the Teals. But I think that it is the right thing to do. And I say this partly as the Shadow Special Minister of State as well, which has responsibility for the Electoral Commission and electoral reform, is that more reform would be a good thing. I think the donation caps and spending caps overall has been good for New South Wales.
Yeah, I think it was a good reform. I support it. I argued very strongly for it in the Greens when O'Farrell brought it in. And I think that the reforms that Farrell has brought in, and supported by the coalition, are a step in the right direction. Interestingly, the Teals hate that. They say that this creates an unfair advantage yet they've got, some pretty heavy hitters in their back pocket.
Well, if they're truly a grassroots movement, then they should be able to get $5 and $10 donations from hundreds or thousands of people. But we all know that they're getting millions of dollars from high net worth individuals like Simon Holmes Accord. That's where they're getting their money from. So of course they oppose any reform that brings in donation caps or expenditure caps, because their view in many ways is the same as Donald Trump's, which is that you should be able to give an unlimited amount of money. You should be able to spend an unlimited amount of money. And the only difference is that they might not like Elon Musk because he gives money to Trump and the Republican Party, but they've got their own donors worth billions of dollars giving them money as well. It's just incredibly hypocritical.
And what's interesting too is that, electors are smart. They like, if you don't have a good idea, it's going to show up. And so we see with Palmer, the trumpet of idiots, he has just spammed the entire electorate.
Yeah.
And he did it last time, hundreds of millions of dollars. He's doing it this time to get, and I'd expect him to get a similar result, like 1 or 2% of the vote. Like the money is never going to trump a really good idea.
No, it amplifies your message. It buys social media ads and TV ads, radio ads. It allows you to do direct mail outs and advertising. But at the end of the day, people will vote on ideas, but it helps get your ideas, your message to as many people as possible. And people need to hear or see an idea 5 or 6 times before it actually sinks in, which is why our politics is so repetitive, which is very boring to people like you and I in the political game when we hear people using the same slogan over and over again. It's because we need to reinforce that message with the average voter.
As an economist and someone who pays attention to taxation, what do you think are some of the good things that the O'Farrell, Baird, Berejiklian, Perrottet governments did, and what do you think remains undone? What do you think we need to do?
I think a few things we did well. We definitely, we increased the payroll tax threshold, so a few times, meaning that every year a small business that might employ, say, 10 people would start hitting that threshold and needing to pay payroll tax. So we did increase that.
And it's a huge tax in New South Wales, isn't it?
It is. I think it's about a third of our revenue or something.
Yeah, it's like 40 billion or something like that.
It's also one of the most inefficient taxes. Every tax review has said it's one of the most inefficient. It's a tax on jobs, essentially. The larger your payroll, so the more people you employ,
the more successful you are,
the more tax
and there's
you
this
have to pay.
threshold you hit where you go, I'm going to get big and employ another 100 people, but it's going to cost me, millions.
That's right. So I think that increasing the threshold there was good. I think that it would have been good to tackle payroll tax earlier in the term. I think that by the time we did it, and it was a great reform, it was in our final year. I actually, I was only in for 1 year, but I actually did get to vote on the First Home Buyers Choice program. It would have been good, I think, had we have done that earlier, so that we had a lead in time so people could see how successful it was, and we could have we could have developed that and entrenched that, which has now been removed. But I think that giving people a choice between paying stamp duty or paying a small annual land tax was a good idea. And ideally, if you're creating the tax system from scratch today, you wouldn't have stamp duty at all. Stamp duty, like payroll, is an incredibly inefficient tax, a tax only paid by those people who buy and sell property. So if you move around a lot, say you've got a job that takes you from place to place, interstate or into regional New South Wales quite often, you would have to pay the tax many, many times in your lifetime. Whereas if you live in the family home and you inherit it from your parents and you live there for your entire life, you'd never pay stamp duty, not once. You'd never pay $1 in it. So it's incredibly unfair, incredibly inefficient. The sooner it goes, the better. And that's something that I think we should look at in the future as a parliament.
The coalition, were in power for, how long were they in power for?
12
years. So for 12 years, got a bit rocky towards the end there with your coalition partners, the National Party. Why don't you take the Nats on? Like you did in Port Macquarie. You recently had
and we won.
And you won. And you won. Wes Fang came on. He was very down in the dumps about that. But how come, like, because you look at the coalition and different iterations around the country, we've got the Country Liberal Party in the Northern Territory. There's the LNP, which is an amalgam of two parties. You've got the formal coalition in New South Wales. I think the same in Victoria. In WA, they're separate parties. Why don't you adopt, say, the model of WA, where you contest them and then you talk about it after the result?
Yeah, look, it's a good point. I think there's a view that the coalition is better off together in government and in opposition. In New South Wales, we have been in coalition, I think, continuously since about World War II in this state. It's more than a coalition, a temporary coalition of mutual interest. It's perpetual. It's a marriage more so than just a self-interest sort of alliance. Unlike almost any other coalition in the world, I mean, if you look at Europe, for instance, or in Asia, coalitions are formed and disintegrate election by election or even midterm, and it's all about who can get to 50% plus one on the floor of whatever parliamentary chamber that they're in. The coalition here is different. There is a long history. We've worked incredibly well together. I think sometimes we need to have a little bit of product differentiation because we are separate parties. When I first joined the Liberal Party, I basically thought we were the same party because I watched Question Time religiously as a high school student. That's how much of a nerd I was. And when you see them in the chamber, and you see it in our chamber as well, you would think, oh, they're basically the same party. They're backing each other up. They sit together. They've got the same leadership and policies, and there's almost no difference. And then when you join the Liberal Party or the National Party, you realise that they operate entirely separately in every way except in the Parliament.
Yeah, their organisations completely separate.
Yeah, and I think
you organise and you do everything internally, pre-selections.
That's right.
The executives are structured completely differently.
Yeah.
Like I didn't know, like no one knows how the Nats do their business. That's their secret. They're like the Masons.
Yeah.
And I asked Wes about it and he said, yes, we all get together, altar, little aprons. No, he didn't say that. But he told me how it works with their state council and their electoral councils and it sounded pretty democratic actually.
Yeah. And look, they're a sectional interest, or they're a regionally based party. The Liberal Party is different in that we would like to say we're for everyone. We're for the individual. We're not for the trade union movement. We're not just for voters in the regions or the city. Where we think that we present a set of values and ideas like individual, the market, freedom, that should appeal to everyone regardless of where you live. Now, it means that most of the times we can see eye to eye with our National Party friends and cousins, but not always. There are times when there are issues that might divide us. I remember in Wentworth, where I'm quite actively involved in the eastern suburbs, at the last election in 2022, they did like a face mash between Barnaby Joyce and Dave Sharma, our candidate there, and they called him Sharmaby, trying to say that if you vote for Dave Sharma, you get Barnaby Joyce, because Barnaby's not a very popular figure in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, even though obviously he's incredibly popular in regional New South Wales and regional Queensland and areas like that. So it was about trying to bring down the Liberal vote in the inner city areas. So it's sometimes not easy to be in coalition, and sometimes we do need to differentiate a little bit more. And I think it's quite mature of us to say that we're going to have differences of opinion and we might not have the exact same policy on every single issue all of the time. Why not, on occasion, rarely, very, very rarely, why not have a slight difference of opinion? We're not the same party. We're in coalition, yes, but I don't think we need the exact same policy 100% of the time.
Well, you did sort it out on climate change ultimately, because that was
Yeah.
very contentious, and you did come up with a policy which I think is pretty good.
Yeah.
Which was the roadmap for net zero by 2050.
Yeah.
That must have been a difficult process to go through in that coalition.
Yeah, before my time, but I think Matt Keane did an excellent job. He brought together the coalition, as well as I think the entire parliament bar One Nation, or pretty much everyone bar One Nation. So he got almost near consensus on an issue that had completely divided the Liberal Party.
Australian politics for 20 years.
Definitely. And, in many ways, when Turnbull lost the leadership the first time against Abbott, it was because of the emissions trading scheme. And then in many ways, when he lost it the next time, it was because of the neg. I remember was it the National Energy Guarantee or whatever it was? It had completely divided the Liberal Party at a federal level for 10 or 15 years.
But it had divided Labor and the union movement and Labor and industry. I remember Bob Brown saying this back in the early 2000s. He said that climate policy will be central to who forms government in this country for the next generation. Yeah. And I think a lot of people scoffed at him and said, well, that's wishful thinking. But if you look at the Rudd Howard and then Rudd Gillard, those issues, Abbott Turnbull, it was absolutely central to it. But it seems to have, there seems to be a consensus to some extent. What's your view of sort of looking forward, something that's right on the agenda for us? And we'll get to federal politics because we're 2 weeks out. But it really does matter for New South Wales. Is the federal coalition's plan for nuclear power? How does that sit with you as a classical Liberal to have publicly funded power generators on the agenda again? Nuclear power generators.
Sure. And I made a couple of comments in the chamber on this maybe 6 or 12 months ago. I think that I'm probably genuinely technologically neutral in my approach. I have no problems with nuclear power at all. I think we should lift the ban. I think it's absurd that we have either the first or second highest amounts of uranium in the world. It is essentially carbon neutral or near carbon neutral in its approach. And we are one of the most geologically stable countries in the world, that we don't have huge amounts of earthquakes and tsunamis. I mean, they've got nuclear reactors in Japan, but we don't have them here in Australia, and they're on a geological fault line. So I've got no problems with nuclear power at all. Just like I have no problems at all with renewables, wind or solar, but I think that, or gas, but I just think that I don't like the idea of taxpayer money propping up energy sources, any energy source. Coal, I don't think that we should be using taxpayer funds to extend the life of coal-fired power plants, or for the government to own and operate nuclear power plants, or to artificially prop up renewables. Surely there's a better way where the private sector can be involved in putting in capital to develop these projects, and then let the energy sources compete against each other. I think too often in Australia, the divide is between the left that say renewables only and the right that says let's have gas and coal and nuclear. And in reality, it should be, well, let the government get out of the way, let them compete against each other. And in many ways, that's what was behind the RESs and the renewable energy roadmap. And often renewables are cheaper because it doesn't cost much to produce wind or solar, for instance. The difficulty is with wind and solar is what you do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, which is why you need gas, or you need nuclear, or you need some type of backup.
Batteries.
Batteries, exactly. And I think that I'm hopeful that either the nuclear technology gets much better, like the small modular reactors, which don't seem to be in operation in any real way yet, or that our battery storage capacity gets much better, because then it will mean that we can move towards net zero in a much faster way and in a sustainable way, in a way that we don't need to massively reduce our standards of living by reducing carbon. And I think that the main ways of doing that is through batteries or nuclear, because then we don't need to trash the economy in the process.
Do you think that we can do the nuclear thing? When you look at the the lead times, say for something that's comparable, say a waste incinerator.
Yeah.
Like there's been people who've been proposing waste incinerators, and forget the argument, the environmental argument about whether or not you should be incinerating your waste and all the rest of it. But just, it's a big, heavy industry that has some risks, but other countries manage it. We can't get one of those built in this country because of NIMBYism.
Yes.
Do you think that can be overcome in the time that's needed to actually make a difference when it comes to nuclear? I mean, like Dutton's proposing, I think, Muswellbrook and Lithgow. They're not a million miles from Sydney and Newcastle, so
no, they're not. But I think what is smart is by saying that we're going to convert essentially coal-fired power plants into nuclear reactors. Nobody's living next door to a coal-fired power plant. So they're already there. So I think you reduce the NIMBYism. Whereas like in some prior proposals, like, we're going to do Jervis Bay or Port Kembla or, I don't know, areas where people live and that aren't used currently for
the headland at Manly.
Yeah, well, that's always a good scare campaign.
Yeah,
but I think that if you take what's already there and then convert it, then you do reduce the NIMBYism. But there is a fair point about like how quickly can these nuclear power plants come online. We take a huge amount of time to build things in this country. It takes years and years just to build an apartment block or a highway. Western Sydney Airport, for instance. Unlike other countries, less democratic countries, mind you, like China, where they can build things very quickly, but they also have very little regard for what the local population thinks. So I don't know
workplace health and safety,
or environmental standards or labor standards, whatever it might be. They can just build it. So it probably will take a while to build. Well, it does take a long time to build big infrastructure projects. I don't know how long it will take to build nuclear power plants. I mean, I've heard probably around the 15-year mark. In the meantime, and this is the point that Mark Speakman makes, in the meantime, the coal-fired power plants are coming offline. We need something in between coal and nuclear before the first nuclear power plant is built. And that means that we're going to need to have a mix of renewables through our RESs and our roadmap combined with gas. We're going to need to do that. We can't just go from coal to nuclear even if you wanted to, because it's going to take 15 years before nuclear comes online at the earliest.
Speaking of, people being NIMBYs and just saying no in their backyard, you're a just say yes kind of guy. And I'm not talking about my favourite topic here, where we might be. We'll get to that later. But you're the leader of the YIMBYs, yes in my backyard, which is a big shift. It's a political shift because a lot of the support base for the Liberals, it's quite a brave policy position to be taking, have from the leafy, well-established areas of Sydney and of New South Wales that haven't had a lot of development, have been resistant to changes that affect the amenity of their community. You're leaning into that and saying, look, it's time for some of these areas to shoulder the burden of increased density and when it comes to building, and for us to cut some of the red or green tape that's associated with how long it takes to get significant developments up and running in this state.
Yeah. Look, I'm proudly probably the most YIMBY member of Parliament, and I wear it as a badge of honour. I think that we need more housing supply. Why is it that in 1984 you could buy a house for about 5 times your average annual income? Today in Sydney, it's about 13 or 14 times your average annual income. And people my age are being pushed to the outer fringes of Sydney to buy that house at 14 times their average income, rather than the more desirable locations closer to the city, closer to where they work, closer to amenities, compared to where people would have bought in the past. So I think it's inherently unfair, meaning we do need a lot more housing supply. Home ownership rates are dropping, and I think for the Liberal Party, the thing that, because a lot of older party members disagree with me, they don't want any more density in Kalara or in Rose Bay or areas like that. But the point I would make to them is that we should be the party of home ownership. We don't want to see the hollowing out of the middle class where only the super rich can afford to buy property and then everybody else is essentially renting or in public housing. We want a large property owning middle class, and people that do own property are actually far more likely to vote for the Liberal Party. People that rent or people in public housing are more likely to vote for the Labor Party or the Greens. So long term, as Liberals, why would we want?
So just on that point, why is that? Because they become more self-reliant.
Yeah,
they're richer. They're more able to, less dependent on the state.
Yeah, I think all of those reasons. They want to conserve their property, their way of life. They're more invested in society. Also, it's not exactly. It's correlation and causation here, because people that own their own property also tend to be older, and people that rent tend to be younger. So is it renters tend to lean more Labor, Greens, homeowners Liberal, but also the types of people that rent versus the types of people that own. There is an age divide as well, and older people do tend to vote for the Liberal Party. So there is a divide there, but I think that I think that it's good for society and good for the Liberal Party overall if we have a higher proportion of homeowners. I think most people want to be a homeowner. They don't want to rent. Some people want to rent. Some people need to rent. Some people move around a lot and they need that flexibility. But a lot of people in their 20s and 30s are renting as what they hope to be a temporary measure, so that one day they can buy their own home. And we shouldn't get in the way of that. We need a lot more density. The other point I would make is I think you can alleviate a lot of the NIMBY concerns if you built in a higher quality, more beautiful way. I think some of the apartment blocks that we build in this city are quite frankly revolting. And they're very low quality. They're filled with defects, and they look like they're from the Soviet Union. They don't look very nice. If we could build these beautiful Art Deco style buildings in the 20s and 30s, why can't we build buildings today with our advances in engineering and technology that are a little bit nicer than the ones that we're currently building? When you talk to these NIMBYs, often they say, well, I live in this leafy street in Kalara with Californian bungalows, and you're going to put some brutalist box at the end of my street. But if you actually built it in a way that did fit in with the existing natural environment and built environment, I think that you wouldn't have as much opposition as you do. So I'd say that I'm a YIMBY. I'd also say that I'm a BIMBY, or beauty in my backyard. And I think you can alleviate a lot of the NIMBY concerns as a result.
Yeah, I was having a look at some of the apartments for sale in Potts Point, and there's beautiful Art Deco ones there, amazing. That are probably heritage listed now. And then this morning I was out at Burwood, and I saw a couple there that looked like gigantic urinals. I was just like, what is that? So I think we go for a long way to alleviating some of that concern if we up some of the standards around design, but allowed people to be able to build in a cost-effective and timely way. It's a fascinating area, and it's a big debate that's going on in the federal election. It's got primacy in the federal election. It's an incredible election campaign because it was a 50-50 6 weeks ago. There was good money on Dutton at least forming a minority government. potentially with some sort of more conservative rural independence and the rest, that's sort of faded away into probably a minority a Labor government, with the coalition really scrambling and not having the best campaign. One of the key things that's, and we'll get into that, but one of the key things that's washed through this has been Trump.
Yeah.
And it's just every day you have to wake up
Yeah.
and check what's happened in the world, and it's just what's coming out of Donald Trump's brain, which is a worry, I think. As a classical liberal, what's your take on Trump and the tariffs for one?
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm completely free trade. I'm
I mean, the Liberal Party was born out of a free trade party, wasn't it?
That's right.
It was
George Reed. And
George Reed.
Our,
it was such
our earlier parties were
free trade, and
traders.
it was just absolutely fundamental to the survival of Australia that we're an export nation. We have always been an export nation. Small population, big continent, producing a lot of goods. If we were going to make money, we had to get our wool, our nickel, our iron ore somewhere else. Tariffs were a killer.
Yeah.
It's the antithesis of what you stand for, isn't it?
That's
tariffs.
Right. I'm completely opposed to tariffs and Donald Trump's tariffs. It's bad for the global economy. It's bad for the American economy because it means higher consumer prices to American consumers, and it's bad for the rest of the world that produces high quality goods to sell to America. I think free trade has been one of those concepts that is I said it's efficaciously beautiful, both in theory and in practice. Because if you look at it in theory, and you can do a supply and demand graph and deadweight loss and things like that, that it works in theory, but so many economic concepts, when you test them in practice, don't really work. Free trade does. It makes everybody better off. In Australia, it means our producers can sell more on the global market. It means as consumers, we can get a higher variety of goods of high quality at cheaper costs, which has a deflationary effect on our economy. You don't need to pay $10,000 for a television if you can buy it for $1,000, or a car, or consumer items like that, textiles and clothing and footwear. It means that people are lifted out of poverty. I mean, China, for instance, over 800 million people lifted out of poverty since Deng Xiaoping opened up the borders
in a generation
to capital, to free trade, to capitalism. Yeah, that's right. And I mean, how great is that for humanity, that hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty? And also from a world peace perspective, is that nations that are deeply integrated economically, that trade with each other, don't go to war with each other. Like most of the wars that we've had post-World War II haven't been between free market liberal democracies that freely trade with each other. It's been, and you look even today, that the great enemies of the West we don't trade with them. It's, North Korea and Russia, China as a peer competitor, I suppose, is the exception where there is a lot of trade there, which is why the relationships so difficult. But in the past, Iran and Iraq and countries like that. So yeah, I think that the countries that trade together don't go to war with each other. So it's overall tariffs it's a terrible idea, and it is hurting the Australian economy. It's going to hurt the American economy, and you see the stock market responding to that. I mean, I think it's been some of the worst losses on the stock market over the last week or two. And the only thing that has lifted it in a short-term temporary sort of way has been the 90-day freeze. But when Trump reacts in the future, once that period ends, then there could be further losses on the world market as well.
And it was certainly part of Trump's election campaign, but really, the manner in which he's brought them in, the extent to which he's brought them in, friend and foe alike, has shocked a lot of people. The election was fought on this, drain the swamp, DEI, these sort of almost social issues. We don't trust big government, all the rest. And yet after the election, we get this announcement of Trump of tariffs. it's something I raised in another interview, is this attack on Canada.
Yes.
And I think it's caused a lot of disquiet in Australia
Yeah.
that such a key ally of the United
Yeah.
States, Canada. I mean, integrated socially, geopolitically, geographically, in economically, and yet Trump's talking about taking over Canada.
Yeah.
I think it's caused a lot of disquiet in Australia about the nature of our alliance and how reliable it is if this guy all of a sudden becomes isolationist and forgets the last 100 years of being a key ally.
Yeah, I think he cares very little about the liberal democratic world order that America created. I mean, after World War II, America created NATO. America created these links between free democratic countries.
The UN.
Yeah, and the UN, and there's no better ally better allies than Canada and Australia to the United States, and we're hit with tariffs. So it's incredibly unfair. I don't know why he's so anti. Why he doesn't treat his allies with more respect and more decency. Yet he somehow sucks up to autocrats like Putin. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. And then the way he treated Zelensky in the Oval Office was just so bizarre and disrespectful. But I think they're probably the two biggest problems that I have with Trump is the tariffs and Ukraine, and they've been very recent things. And I think Australians inherently they probably dislike both of those things as well. I think a lot of people on the left have never liked Trump. They hate Trump and all that he stands for. But I think even people on the right in Australia and in Canada, the tariffs and Ukraine in particular, I think have really changed their view. They might like him on some things like the Doge or some of the DEI stuff or whatever.
Yeah.
But
he's an anti-politician and he's he's a disruptor.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Ukraine's are like one that I think is just so shocking that that he could walk away from a situation where you essentially have World War I trench warfare, hand-to-hand combat that's killing tens of thousands of young Ukrainian men and women a week.
Yeah.
Like just in one battlefield, there's been, which is just one part of the southern front. There's been 50,000 Russians. I don't know how many Ukrainians killed in this stretch of front, which is like about 150 kilometers long.
Yeah.
Provatorsk, it's near, a bit just near Bakhmut, but 50,000 Russians.
Yeah.
And like Putin's prepared to murder 50,000 of his own people and however many Ukrainians. The Chinese are turning up there now.
Yeah.
North Koreans are turning up there. And Trump's prepared to make Zelensky the bad man.
It goes to my point before that the reason liberal democracies don't go to war with each other is that the cost is too high.
Yeah.
Russia's not a real democracy. And he doesn't care if he loses 50,000 Russians on the front line because he doesn't need to face the electorate. And I think that's why you don't see liberal democracies going to war, whereas you do with autocracies or totalitarian sort of states. I don't know how the war will end because if you say, oh, we should have a deal and then you carve out a third of Ukraine and give it to Russia, you're sending the signal that might is right and that any powerful country in the world can sort of just annex part of another country and get away with it. By the same token, if you keep fighting and you keep up the pressure, Putin is so proud and a nuclear state that he's not just going to give in. He can't capitulate now. So both of their backs are to the wall, and it's hard to see how it actually ends. I don't support.
Well, the Europeans have taken a massive step by cutting off the gas, which long term structurally for Russia is an absolute economic disaster.
Yeah.
Surely, just isolating them in terms of geopolitically sanctions on there. You're not coming to the Olympics, you're not coming to the UN, and we're not trading with
and
you.
that's how they fell. The Soviet Union fell in many ways. Is that they were isolated from the rest of the world.
No blue jeans for you. No Beatles records for you.
That's right. And they essentially went into a terrible depression. And the only way of recovering was opening up. So that could happen again potentially. But they don't have a very strong history of democracy in Russia, which is concerning compared to the rest of Europe essentially.
Yeah, it is concerning, and it is concerning. And we've got a world leader like Trump who's just, I think, perpetuating what is like a horrendous carnage. But it has certainly washed through the election campaign.
Yeah.
So the tariffs, of course, massive volatility on the stock market. We see massive losses, a rebound, but it's a dead cat bounce effectively. A lot of people looking at their super, wondering what's going to happen. And it's changed the dynamics in the federal election campaign. How's it going for Peter Dutton, mate? You can tell the truth here. No one's listening. I mean, he seems to be staggering along. It seems as if he's staggering into this headwind of this Trump, these international politics that are created by Trump, and a few missteps along the way. It seems as if it's falling away from him.
But look, I don't think it is popular to be linked with Trump at this point in time. I think early on in the campaign, I think if you go back a couple of months, it actually was somewhat helpful for Peter Dutton, because it was like, well, maybe he can get a better deal for us. Maybe the politics of the day is moving towards the right. And it may have been actually helpful early on. Now it has become quite, I think, unhelpful to have links between the Liberal Party and Donald Trump. Even if you saw Jacinta Price, she said "Make Australia Great Again," which then they had to walk back from. So the calculation that the Liberal Party has made, obviously, is that it's not popular or helpful to be linked with Trump. And look, I don't think that. I think it's unfair. I mean, the Liberal Party is very different to Trump. I mean, what has Peter Dutton done to say that he's going to be in any way similar to Trump? He's anti-tariffs and pro-free trade. He's pro Ukraine and anti-Putin. Like what policies exactly are we Donald Trump 2.0? I think it is unfair. But I think that the Labor Party dirt unit is making the connection. They're trying to make that link as much as they can. And I think that in terms of how are we going overall, I think if you look at it, Labor only have a 2-seat majority, but we need something like 19 seats to get a majority ourselves. I think it's a pretty safe bet to say that it's going to be a hung parliament. Now, how many seats will Labor lose? How many will the coalition pick up? Is changing day by day as the election campaign goes on, and there's still 2 and a bit weeks to go.
And a wild card is, the Teals, whether or not they're, still popular with climate change sort of coming off the boil. They've been seen to operate collectively, which is sort of not sort of what was on the tin in terms of independence. But there are more independents running, more micros, Palmer as well, a rising sort of other independents vote.
Yeah.
We just don't know, do we?
No, that's right. And I mean, I think it was in the 1990 federal election, I think about 9% of people voted for a minor party, so anything other than Labor and the coalition. At the last federal election, it was about a third, or over a third of Australians that said no to either the Labor Party and the coalition and voted for a minor party. So it is a far more fragmented environment. And in all of these, in so many seats, it's not just Liberal versus Labor. It's Liberal versus Teal, or Labor versus Greens, or, it's a very strange electoral map. It's harder to compute and to understand. It is really seat by seat, and things can change in 2 weeks. I think in 2019, even 2 weeks out, everybody thought that Bill Shorten was going to become Prime Minister. I only changed my view in that election maybe 2 or 3 days out, and I thought, I think Morrison might win this one. But I kept it very quiet, very much to myself, because it was the sort of zeitgeist at the time was that Bill Shorten was going to win. So anything can happen in an election campaign, and we've seen that in prior elections as well. I mean, Howard came back so many times from behind to win. People didn't expect Trump to win in 2016. People didn't expect Brexit to pass in, or was it 2016 or whenever it was. So look, anything can happen, but I think people are hurting in terms of cost of living, and that's usually not a good sign for the incumbent government. Incumbency is almost death at the moment because of high inflation and high interest rates. There's been a little bit of a reprieve for Albo in that interest rates have come down 25 basis points and inflation's a little bit lower, but there's still that lingering cost of living squeeze that I think people in the outer suburbs in particular are very unhappy about.
Yeah, they certainly are, and you wonder how much of it's just the political class and the media class just having to jumping at every little movement of the leaders and the campaign. How much is the electorate paying attention? Because a lot of people don't tune in until very late. We've had this massive a diversification in where people are getting their media now. So much more online, social media. Are people just in their echo chambers? So whether or not especially the media class picking this up, we just don't know.
Look, social media is my view. I've thought this maybe for the last 12 months or so, is that there is now no difference between the traditional media and social media or podcasts like this one. People are getting their news from a huge array of different sources, and people don't really put much more emphasis on the major newspapers versus Instagram or TikTok or podcasts. I mean, I think one of the reasons Donald Trump won, not the only reason, but one reason was that he outgunned Kamala in podcasts by something like 10-1 in terms of the number of hours that he spent on podcasts having a casual chat like this one. So in many ways, you're right. Like, how much of this is the media actually picking up on? We're very much in the bubble, and real Australia out there might be thinking something quite different to us.
It's a really interesting point you make, because for a long time the media class has looked at social media like down their noses. Said, well, you didn't do a communications degree, you haven't been a cadet, you haven't worked your way up and all the rest, and you think you can just set up with a studio and start your own TV channel. And the truth is, you can. Yeah. And it comes down to to your reach, the quality of the people you have on, and so it's the reason we started this podcast, because mainstream media's, what are they going to say about legalized cannabis all the time? And it's a way for us to have a conversation, to get around some of the sort of the shadow bans in some of the social media, like TikTok, Meta. It is a really, really powerful way, I think, for people to go, well, here's a channel where people are having a conversation. I'll make my own mind up.
And we can't just wish that we're going to go back. Yeah. Like this view that, I wish we're back in the 90s or the early 2000s, where the news was generated by the major newspapers, the talkback radio stations, and the 6 o'clock news. That's not going to happen. We're not going to go back to that. For political parties like mine and yours, is that we need to adapt. We need to be more engaged on social media, do podcasts, do these types of
It's like things. The advent of TV, when all of a sudden, radio was king, and, you could give a great address, and then all of a sudden you had to have great hair. Yes. Because it was Kennedy.
That's why JFK did so well.
Yeah, Kennedy had great hair, and, Nixon's sweating and looking like a shifty bastard.
Yeah, the people that listened on radio thought Nixon had won.
They thought he'd won.
The people that watched on TV clearly said JFK.
Just said, that guy's got great teeth.
Yeah.
And I'm voting for the guy with the hair.
Yeah.
The podcasting is a great disruptor. A really interesting thing that's emerging though is paid podcasting,
Yeah.
paid appearances. It's happened like whether or not podcasters have to disclose whether or not they're receiving money, and especially if there's someone's coming on and saying vote for me, it's an interesting area that probably will need regulation, because if there's a commercial relationship between someone, and there's none between us, let's be clear about that.
No,
you haven't paid for this, and I'm not.
So if in other cases, would I be paying you or would you be paying me?
I'm not sure.
Who's the influencer? Or
It's
am I paying to come on your podcast?
Yeah, you think I'm the influencer. That's
Right.
because I've got the podcast. But in actual fact, you're the influencer. That's the subversive
I'm
part.
promoting the podcast.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's a subversive part.
Yeah.
And we've got you, Chris, sitting next to a gigantic cannabis leaf.
That's right.
For 2 hours, and not wilting and not running away and screaming.
But look, they might need to disclose it in the future. I've seen this only in the last few days, and some of the
Abbey
Teals getting
Chatfield,
called out, and Labor, and that should you have to disclose paid content, the cash for comment type scandals of the past. And I think there is a fair point there in that if it was TV or a newspaper, you clearly know that it's advertising, that it's paid for. But that might not be as clear when it comes to influencers and social media.
And just if you had to pay to come on this, and then I say, and I'm not going to accept money from someone else, well, that becomes an issue. That really does become. I mean, people have got their own volition and they can make their own choices. But it is an interesting area, and also it's within that space. I think what's happened is that, like, a lot of the people think podcasting's been around for a long time. I've only been doing a deep dive into it for the last year. It really is like about 5 or 6 years that it has, like, during COVID and post-COVID, become something more relevant and influential, because podcasters stopped talking to themselves. It was all this niche of basically echo chambers, groupthink. It was sort of, like left-wing people talking to other left-wing people about things they all agreed with. And then on the right, the same thing. It was like Fox News. It was basically, we all think the same thing. Very little sort of discussion and dialogue, which I think that people really want. And they don't want their media digested by an algorithm or a big media corporation. Like, they don't want whoever the journalist is to tell them this is what happened.
Yes.
When you can actually go and see for yourself. I think that people with technology want that immediacy. They want that intimacy in what happens in a conversation.
I think so. I think one thing that is concerning, though, and you touched on it before, is that when it was a traditional media landscape in the 90s and the early 2000s, and that is that the media was probably more centrist and was catch-all in that it tried to appeal to everyone. Now, and you mentioned the echo chamber, now I think that whether it's on Twitter or Instagram and TikTok, the algorithms, what you see is it reinforces your political views over and over and over again. So if in my feed, like my feed and yours would be very different. And I do try to follow some people, on the sort of center left as well, and even the hard left, some. But you get sort of a reinforcing of your worldview over and over again. So I think that the podcast can help in that they, it's a longer form. It's not 30-second digestible, TikTok content, and hopefully, you can get some good ideas out of it rather than just 30-second sound bites reinforcing your bias or your worldview. Because I think it probably has polarized Australia and polarized America. It's not the only reason, but I think it's one of the reasons why we have a more polarized society today. Like, you think about it, I mean, Reagan won 49 out of 50 states. I mean, can you imagine the Republican Party or the Democrats winning 49 or out of 50 states.
Really,
today.
wow, that's incredible.
Reagan in '84 won every state except
on
Minnesota.
the popular vote, or really,
on the electoral,
wow, the electoral college
won
votes,
49 states.
amazing.
And to think that the Republican Party was winning Massachusetts or California, they couldn't do that today. Or I think FDR won maybe 40, 45, or 46 or something. Winning that just wouldn't happen today. And I think in part, not the only reason, but I think in part, it's because our news, our media is reinforcing the bias that we have, and people are increasingly in this echo chamber. Which I think has been unhelpful.
I totally agree, and I think it's unhelpful, but I think it's pushed people out, and the tide goes in, the tide goes out, and I think the reaction to it is, oh, hold on, that's what's happened here. There's a huge cohort of people out there saying things that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And so once people realise that, and this is just this gigantic global social experiment about what the types of things you get in your feed, what the algorithms feed into, and in terms of people that are defending democracy, AI and these massive companies, these social media companies, really have an incredible power that we really haven't seen before. If you look at the influence of Zuckerberg and Musk now, it's something that really is a threat to democracy, isn't it?
Well, we were promised flying cars, and in the end, we got 140 characters or less. So I don't know if
where's the hoverboard?
I know. All we've got is podcasts and tweets and TikToks. I would have thought by now. Didn't they say by the year 2000 we're going to have flying cars? Anyway, but
Musk said we do have flying cars. They're called helicopters,
right.
And all the flying cars are just too noisy.
Yeah.
They're just way too noisy. It's just a drone.
Yeah, but no. Look, the social media companies do have a lot of power, and I think that part of me thinks that if you don't like one platform, you can go to another. And I think what Musk showed, I'm not a huge Musk fan, but what he did show was that Meta's not just going to have all of the power to sort of curate the news and use their algorithms. And then Musk bought Twitter, which I think everyone still calls it Twitter, but he's renamed it X, and he's said, we're going to do things a little bit differently. And I think that there is this debate in economic free market circles about, when is something a market failure? When does monopoly or oligopoly get too big? There isn't enough competition, and there can't be new entrants being allowed to sort of come in. And one view is, if one business is censoring out opinion or regulating news too much, there'll be a new entrant that comes in and they'll do things differently. No one's forcing you to be on Facebook. No one's forcing you to be on Twitter. You can leave that platform and go to another one, and some billionaire can set up a new news site, and that's what Musk did. And now even Zuckerberg is walking back some of the DEI stuff because of Trump, largely, and he's sort of groveling at the altar of Trump, which is almost a bit pathetic, given where he was only a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And look, generations, they look at it and say, that's just daggy. Like my stepkids just don't know what Facebook is.
Yeah, I don't use Facebook. I think I've got a Facebook account that my staff posts stuff on, but I never use it.
Yeah.
I'm on Instagram and Twitter, and that's basically it.
Yeah, I'm here on YouTube. I think that's it's pirate radio. That's what YouTube is.
YouTube is seriously it's almost forgotten about by the political class. Is that everyone jumps on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, but YouTube is actually in many ways where people are getting a huge amount of their news from, and you'd be surprised the value of YouTube ads compared to other media sources. It's almost, I think it's forgotten about because journalists and the political class don't go onto YouTube for news.
Yeah, they don't, and what they don't understand is that so many younger people do. There's a cohort of people that do, and it's not in the form that they would expect. It's in conversations and in a sort of like almost infomercials, and it's a different form. People are building their understanding about it, but I think it's incredibly powerful and incredibly diverse. Looking out around the world, like what do you think the future is for the modern Liberal Party? You know, in the modern context, there's just so many different models out there. Do you look at the UK Conservatives? Like Australia does its own thing. There's no doubt about it. Like our Labor Party in Australia is different to Labor parties in other parts of the world. Our Green Party is very different to the Green parties in, say, Germany or in South America. But the Liberal Party is the sort of the predominant party of the right. What when you look out around the world, what models do you think that give you like a polar star that the party should look towards, or models that you think will be effective and of use in the Australian body politic?
Yeah, it's not Trump's Republican Party. I can definitely say that. That's not where I look for inspiration. And by one worldview, I would say I still hark back to that sort of Reagan, Thatcher era. But I know we're not going back to that, because the world has changed and moved on, as much as I'm inspired by those figures. I think that we need to.
That's because they won, really. Their neoliberal worldview basically won. They opened up markets, they deregulated, they privatised.
And then centre left politics stole their homework and did it as well. They transformed the global economy. Certainly, the economies in each of their own countries. I think for me, where I would like to see the Liberal Party go is we go back to first principles. And that is, for me at least, that it's the harm principle. It's John Stuart Mill's harm principle. You should be able to do whatever you like so long as you don't harm the life, liberty, or property of someone else. And I think that to voters my age, in their 20s and in their 30s, that's a pretty powerful message. But that's not the way the Liberal Party is often represented. We don't look like the freedom-loving, small government, do what you like party. We are often viewed as the state should tell you what you should do party. We look like the old stuffy conservative party that your grandparents vote for, not the young, hip, do whatever you like so long as you don't harm someone else party. So I think that's where I would like to see it go. And that means economic freedom and social freedom. I think that the Liberal Party in the past has put a lot of emphasis on economic freedom, rightly so, because I think economic freedom drives prosperity, as well as it being morally the correct thing to do. But I think that, we chose the word liberal for a reason, and we should try and get back to first principle beliefs, because one of the concerns at the moment that people have is, oh, well, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, they're basically the same. How are you even different? And if you're looking through this current election campaign, there's not a huge amount of difference. The politics in Australia are pretty centrist, pretty close together. But the two major parties are very different philosophically and historically, and how they were formed. And I think that we shouldn't try and shy away from liberalism or classical liberalism. I think it's not just morally correct and economically correct. I also think that it's popular so long as we explain it properly, which I think we haven't done enough of in recent years. There's a disconnect, I think, between our values and our voters. Often our values might appeal to the young hip entrepreneur, but our voters might be older, outer suburban, retirees, and there might be a difference there, an incongruence between our values and our voters.
And one of the things you've hearkened to is the ownership and being economically, financially independent's a key one. Like, ultimately, do you think the Liberal Party is going to have to look at some of these things, like with negative gearing? It makes property investment essentially risk free. The government's going to subsidise your investment with a tax concession, the capital gains concessions. They basically make these this area of investment incredibly attractive, almost risk free. but it creates this divide between those who do have the either property and the capacity to get into it, wealth, and those that don't. Is that an area the Liberal Party is going to have to look at some time?
Look, I think that it's an interesting debate. I think what really killed it was the 2019 federal election, where Bill Shorten goes to the election promising changes on negative gearing, gets smashed. Everyone thought he was going to win, and he lost. So that has meant that it's been difficult for centre left and centre right politics to look at reform in that area, and people are pretty risk averse. Our political leaders during a campaign. But I think the main issue is actually supply. Every time I hear the housing debate and people talking about tax reform or incentives that they can give to first home buyers, or using your super to buy a home or things like that,
Subsidising demand.
Yeah, there's all these ideas on the demand side, but in reality, we need a huge amount more supply, and I think that and look, immigration's a part of it too, and I'm pro-immigration. I think that it's served Australia well. At the end of the Howard government, migration was at about 150,000 a year. By the Morrison government, it was around 250,000. Now it's about 500,000. Now, the issue is, I think that
that's a massive number, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. In 3 years, it's gone from 4 years, it's gone from 250 to 500. But the issue is that if you're only building about 100,000 new homes a year, but bringing in 500,000 people a year, it's how the relationship between supply and demand works that creates price increases. And that's really where we're at. So I think negative gearing, CGT, super, financial market regulation, incentives to first home buyers, all of this is pretty much on the demand side and might tinker at the edges. Some things I've read about CGT and negative gearing is it might only have a 3 or 4% change in prices if you reform it. But it's really the relationship between migration and housing supply. So we need a lot more homes being built, and probably migration needs to come back down to sort of more sustainable levels. And then I think you'll at least take the heat out of the property market. You might not have huge decreases, and I don't think it's good for the economy to have 20 or 30% per year decreases in house prices. You've got a GFC scenario if that happens. But you also don't want property prices going up at 10 or 15% a year, but your income going up only at 2% a year, because then you have a housing crisis in the way that we've got it today.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area, and one that's vexed us. There was something I was thinking about late last night, and forgive me if I waffle on here, but I was thinking about we're talking about housing, but in actual fact, we're talking about families, because I don't know anyone that has, and families in all their iterations, like a couple, same sex, hetero, people that are going to have kids and don't have kids. They're the people that buy houses usually. Some people go out and they go and buy themselves an apartment. But a lot of the time, and I wonder what the numbers are, it's actually people who go, hey, we're making we're committed to each other. The expression of that, we are a family, is we want to buy property together. And when we talk about housing, we're actually really talking about families, aren't we? We're talking about the incentive for people to go and, to build a life together, to have kids or not, or whatever, but so it's not just about shelter. It's actually about our fundamental, if people can't buy a house together, that helps people. It actually knits our social fabric together.
It does.
Doesn't it?
And I know there's an issue you've raised in the Parliament recently on population, and I think that it's inextricably linked, property prices and fertility, in that from some of the evidence I've seen is that, and you can just, understand it just anecdotally or intuitively, is that if property is now 14 times your average income rather than 5, it means it's going to take a lot longer to buy a home, meaning you're going to start a family later because you can't it's people don't like having a family, in renting a 1-bedroom apartment. They would prefer to do it in a 3 or 4-bedroom home with a backyard. And that's what we're seeing is that women are having children later in life. People are settling down later in life. The fertility rate is dropping. So I actually think that if you graphed fertility rate and house prices over time, there would be a huge correlation. Again, it's not a perfect causation. There's a range of measures, as you know, behind or reasons why our fertility rates dropped off. But I think house prices is one of those things. The other thing I wanted to say was on housing supply is I was listening to a podcast the other day, and Charlotte Morlock, a friend of mine, passed it on to me from the US. And these were essentially tax and spend Democrats that were talking about a theory or a book that they've written on the abundance agenda. And essentially their view was that most of the problems in society today in America, but also here in Australia, is because of a lack of supply. And whether it's housing, it's a lack of supply. And you want it to make people better off, to reduce poverty, to make people have a higher quality of life. You actually want more supply of things, more supply of housing, a greater supply of clean energy, a greater supply of education, and even to the free trade argument. One of the reasons we've got rich is because there's been an abundance of things like electronics or clothing or things like that. And I think that for too long, people on the left have come up with all these obstacles or reasons why you shouldn't have more supply. More regulations, more taxes, which has reduced the ability for people to be productive and to have more supply. And I think nowhere more than in housing. For too long, we've had red and green tape choking housing development in Sydney and in Australia.
But it's not, and it's not just in the city too. Like, one of my bugbears, and I'm going to raise this in the Parliament, is the RU1 zoning.
Yeah.
So rural zoning,
Yep.
which is the largest zoning in the state. So it's basically general farming, I think it used to be called. So in that zoning, you can build a house.
Yeah.
Natural fact, you can build a second dwelling that was a second dwelling for ostensibly for labourers or family people working on that farm. Now, that zoning applies to properties that can be as small as 1 acre. They're just in this mass in the LEP maps of the RU1. Under current laws, you can build a second dwelling with council approval, but you can't subdivide it.
Right.
So you can't then sell it off. So no one does it.
Yeah.
Which just seems like such a ridiculous thing. If from a planning point of view you say, yes, you can build this property, and you can have this property, but you're not allowed to then sell it. Why? And
it's your property.
It's your property. You should be able to do it. And we recognise that there should be these buildings built. They're going to add to supply. Now, I don't think it's like I don't think it's of itself is I just think it's part of the solution.
But I think I vaguely remember that I think it was Auckland, which one of the reasons they were able to massively increase supply was that they said that you're automatically allowed to build a granny flat and maybe even subdivide without going through council approval. Yeah. And it massively increased supply because a lot of people thought, well, we've got a big backyard, or, we don't need this entire house to ourselves. We're looking to downsize. We need to be comfortable in retirement. And I think it has massively increased supply in Auckland as a result. So I think it's a good idea. It's your property. You should be.
And it's good environmentally, infill development. And I just don't see the problem with, if you've got a 300 hectare property, you've got a property in one corner of it, you build another at the other end. At the moment, you have to wait for a council rezoning, and they're not going to just rezone one little area to residential so that you can subdivide it, but that general zone. I think there's a lot of solutions out there, as you say, on the supply side, infill development. A lot of people want a small, tiny home in the city, in a backyard. They could own it themselves. It's good environmentally. You're making, use of existing infrastructure. And a lot of people, I think, would move to regional areas, especially the peri-urban part, because a lot of regional centres in New South Wales or in Australia, they're just like a city that looks just like any suburb of any major city, and then it's just bush and farm, and no sort of intermediary zone, peri-urban zone.
I think we need a lot more of everything. Like, I think too often in the housing debate, there's been the people that say, let's build more density in the city, versus people that say we need more urban sprawl and housing being built in the outer suburbs and the regions. I think you need both, right? Like, I'm happy to live in the inner city in an apartment. Other people want a backyard and they want a 4-bedroom house. So we need a lot more of both. And I think that I think that often the more desirable locations, as I said, are in the inner city areas. People would like to live there, but they've essentially been locked up by NIMBYs and by councils. And what you do have, which I think is very sad, is that the average age of some of these areas like Glebe or Double Bay or the inner west and inner east areas, the average age is increasing because no young person can afford to live there, and it loses its vibrancy if essentially it's just cashed up boomers that can buy apartments in the inner city because no young person can afford to buy them. You want our inner cities to be vibrant. You want bars and clubs. You want live music. You don't want inner Sydney to be a retirement village, and then people in their 30s being pushed out an hour or 2 hours outside of the city and they have to commute in each day. However, if people want to move to a regional area or want to live in a outer suburban
or get
area,
their foot
they
in
should be
the
allowed
property
to
market, live out in the country for a while. And it's not just the inner city. Like some of it, like in northern New South Wales during COVID, and I know areas like Kiama, they had a massive increase. So those tree change locations in property values, massive spike in demand. Properties went up by 200 or 300% in a very short amount of time. In my little village of Bellingen, we saw it completely transform.
Yeah.
All the young people that made the place interesting. So they were the artists, the musicians. They were starting cafes. They were starting small business. They ran the festivals.
Yeah.
They all got pushed out, and we just saw it. Like, we called it the attack of the Audis. It was just all these white Audis with personalised those Euro number plates.
Yeah, the German artillery coming in.
The German artillery. It was attack of the Panzer Corps, and it was just Beamers, Audis. It was Volkswagens, and it was just like, where did our community go?
Yeah.
All these people came in, and so the hippie health food shop got replaced by the high-end kitchenware shop.
Yeah.
It changed the fabric of our society, but I think for the worse, and I don't think it's fair as a society that we don't recognise that there's a lot more to housing than a house. It's a family. It's a community. It's like it's the makeup of your community, and if you limit the choices of the people, that people have, you limit the people you're going to have in your community, and I think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, look, I agree, and I think that you're right. People don't just buy the roof over their head; they buy a lifestyle. They buy they buy more than just they buy an idea or how they want to live. They don't just buy shelter, and that's a good thing. I mean, people don't make investment decisions solely, housing decisions solely on money. I know I haven't. You buy property based on where you want to live, the quality of life, how you see yourself living, which is a good thing.
Now, speaking of seeing how you see yourself live, and John Stuart Mills, you were talking about if you're not harming anyone else.
I knew you were going to come to this.
I'm gonna. No one gets away unscathed. Drug law reform really is one of, if not the last, but one of the last major social policy Gordian knots that we really haven't unpicked. It costs us a lot of money in terms of treasure. in terms of policing, prohibition, and there are alternative models out there. And it's, it impacts across geography, it impacts across demographics, but the burden of the criminal justice system does fall more heavily on poorer people who are less able to deal with it. Do you think that people who are responsible adults should be able to use cannabis if they're not harming others?
It's a really good question, and it's one that I've thought long about. I don't know is the short answer. I think that I'm open to the debate, which I never used to be. So I've sort of changed my view on this over time, and on drug law reform generally. I think as well is that if you went back 5 or 10 years ago, I was one of those typical, conservatives, 2GB, sort of, lock them up, tough on law and order, the war on drugs. And I just think it hasn't worked. I mean, I'm probably more of a harm minimization guy now. And I think one of the things that changed my thinking, as someone who is very interested in economics, is just how expensive it is in terms of, is it around $100,000 a year to keep someone in prison? Which is an astronomical amount of money to the cost to the taxpayer. Not to mention the courts and the police force and all of the laws and enforcement that's part of it. So I think there's an economic aspect to it, which has opened up my thinking to, well, maybe we don't have the balance right in some ways on drugs generally. I think that there's also an element of freedom that you mentioned, I mentioned before, of, well, if you're not harming anyone else. Now, the harm principle is a great concept, a great principle. It's not an instructive, dogmatic guide in that harm is difficult to compute. Like, I've been in numerous philosophical discussions with people in the Liberal Party about, well, are you harming someone when you do this, or are you harming someone when you do that?
If you're a user of cannabis and you're harming yourself, and then you're not able to fulfill your role as a father, you're harming them.
Yeah, that's right. Or even something like on poker machines or on guns.
Sure.
Should you be able to own a gun or use the pokies or whatever? So there's lots of arguments about, like, well, are you impacting the liberty of someone else or the life of someone else if you make certain things lawful? But I think that more freedom is often the right approach, and then I think there needs to be an element of compassion as well. That on some of these harder drugs like heroin and ice and things like that, a lot of conservatives that do come from a Christian background, I would appeal to their sense of compassion. That just locking people up is not a very compassionate thing to do. Also, surely they believe in redemption. Like, surely people can get back on their own 2 feet and be given a second chance. And it was actually a friend of mine in the Victorian upper house, Evan Mulholland, who actually opened my eyes up to this kind of thinking, both in terms of the freedom angle, but also in terms of the Christian compassionate angle, that maybe this war on drugs that we've had in the past isn't really working. And you do see some red states, some very vocal Republicans that are leaning that way now too, because the US has a huge drug and crime problem, much more so than we do here in Australia. And
by design, though, like a lot of it, if you look at drug policy, the drug policy that came out of Johnson and then Nixon in particular, and then was perpetuated through Carter and Reagan, and even into the Bush administrations, but also what's his name? Oh God, I'm having a mental blank. Bill Clinton. Like it was the Clinton administration that brought in mandatory minimum sentencing, 3 strikes, massive increase in incarceration. And they knew who those people they were going to police were African American and Latino communities on crack and cannabis. They knew that they could catch these people on minor possession and criminalise them, incarcerate them.
And what's the prison population in America now? It's huge.
Oh, it's millions. It's millions.
It's very sad.
It is very sad, but it clearly, like you wonder if it's by design. In Australia, minor drug possession is one of the leading causes of people to become, involved in the criminal justice system. So it creates this criminality that then has this long-term economic and social impact. So it's something that's I don't think is properly understood. That it is often the first step into criminality and adverse outcomes for a lot of people. Well, I'm glad that you're thinking about it, Chris. I think you're going to have to. One of the interesting things about cannabis is that it's, we've emerged as a party. It is it's an issue. Drug use. It moves across geographic, demographic, social class borders. No matter where you're born or where you're from, people do use illicit drugs from time to time, and how we manage them is a cause for concern and an issue for a lot of people in Australia. So I'm glad you're thinking about it.
Yeah. Look, and it's not my area of expertise. I'm more interested in the sort of economics. But there is, as I said before, there is an economics aspect to it. Is that often in the past you've got these hard-nosed sort of free market economics guys that always look at the sort of balance sheets, and they're very interested in tax reform and industrial relations and things like that. But when you look at our budget and the amount of money that we spend on policing and prisons and the courts and things like that, it's if there's a way of doing things better that can be more compassionate and save the taxpayer some money, then we definitely should look at it.
And in terms of economics and free trade, like the industry in the United States, because they've legalized cannabis in like 38 states now, it's an industry that's growing at double digits. It's enormous. I think last year it went past $40 billion. Right. So it's comparable now to the craft beer industry. Right. The entire American wine industry is about $60 billion. So within a decade, it will be bigger than the entire American wine industry. The entire American alcohol industry is $250 billion. Yeah. So it's 25% of their alcohol industry. So it is a gigantic industry, and Australia could be well placed to benefit from it if we regulated it properly, and like we do with so many of our products, produce high quality, like quality assured products and export them to the world. But that's my view. A conversation we'll continue to have. Chris, look, I've kept you for long enough. I really appreciate working with you in the upper house. We don't always see eye to eye, but I always know that you've got a considered and well thought out position.
Oh, thank you.
I don't always agree with the answer, but I know that you've often you're involved in key policy areas and you've put a lot of thought into it. So very much appreciate the work you do, and I really appreciate you coming on Into the Weeds for the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
No worries, Chris.
Thanks.